Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and this week we bring you another Fine Points, and I'm here with Bruce Fein. The topic of today has been advertised as nullification, but I'd like to briefly start off with another topic prior to discussing nullification, because sometimes you get news during the week that provokes your interest in discussing something other things than are advertised. I know from how many people feel that the 2020 elections, many people think it was stolen. Many people think it was poorly administered because of all the mail-in ballots. There were a lot of reports in various media about late night drop-offs and ballot harvesting and all that type of stuff. In the end, in court, almost none of that, if any of that, has been proven in a court of law. And many of the people who have made these claims, when they get under oath, they don't seem to want to repeat these claims under oath. So there's a lot of concern about election fraud. I don't even know if there's a good definition of what meets election fraud. I don't even think, or really what election integrity really means. I think if you ask a bunch of people, they might answer it in a different way, because our election system is an ecosystem. It's not just vote counting. But there are some cases that I think are not about election integrity, but actually about voter suppression. And I'm going to frame it this way, I don't know if it was in Pennsylvania, but many states, when they check ballots, if there's a technical flaw to the ballot, many states are allowing the voter an opportunity to cure a technical flaw. And in many jurisdictions now, they don't want the voter to have even knowledge that they submitted a technical flaw. So remember, this is somebody who there seems to be no doubt is a registered voter with somebody who has a right to vote. Okay, so this is how ready to vote. So if you don't dot an I or sign exactly perfectly, or you're wrong about a date or something like that, or you're missing one data point, even though your identity is clear and your vote is clear, okay, there are a number of states out there that will disenfranchise you. Let me propose it this way. We have a lot of crimes, and we have this concept in the legal system that the punishment should be commensurate with the crime. So if I park in a no parking zone, the question is should I lose my driver's license and my car for the rest of my life? For a year or for a certain period of time. No, we give people a fine so they don't lose the right to drive. Also, it's like the things with respect to when it's considered you filed your vote, as opposed to like when you filed your tax return. We all want the right on April 15th to go at midnight to the post office and have a postmark that proved that while our IRS did not receive our return on the 15th, we filed it on the 15th. We essentially submitted our return, and it should be considered as being submitted on time because we sent it on April 15th, and we have a postmark that says we submitted on April 15th. But with our vote, if we submit our vote on time, and we have evidence that we submitted our vote on time, that we filed our vote on time, people don't seem to want to give people the same benefit of the doubt of saying that they voted on time. You have to vote early if you vote by mail to have your vote counted, and you have to vote sufficiently early so that the voting authorities receive your vote prior to the deadline. And so for some reason, we want different treatment about how we mail in our votes than how we mail in our tax returns. Very, very convenient. I don't think it's very, very convenient. I think people want to find excuses to not count people's votes, especially people who are mailing in votes. So I don't think any of this has to do with election integrity. I think it only or to stop voter fraud. It's only about figuring out how many clever ways legal voters can get disenfranchised and have their vote not counted. Bruce, I sent you a couple of those cases. Maybe you can elaborate further on
Sure.
my comments.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Just to paint some kind of background, I think that puts things in context. Number one, I mean, typically a voting fraud is counting a vote for someone who's identified as the voter did not cast, or not counting the vote correctly, either ignoring it or counting it for the different candidate. It's not all that complex. And in most states, you need to register to vote before you cast a vote. Now, many states have same-day registration. You can show up at the polls, register to vote, and then vote at the same time. The second observation is that there's a reason why voting fraud is so atypical and rare, and that is you're risking a very long prison term for a very, very slim chance that your single vote is going to affect the outcome of the election. And so most people, even if they had a malignant intent, they're not going to take that risk because the likelihood of changing anything by one vote is so tiny. Now, of course, and then if, however, you organized fraud on a huge scale, that could affect tens of thousands, millions of votes. You can't keep it secret. That's going to be detected. And that's why those kind of conspiracies don't happen, because you can't hide it. And the last thing is, I think, the 2020 elections, and they were imperfect like all others. There were 61 lawsuits in various forms, before judges, both Trump judges and Obama judges and Bush judges and Clinton judges, state judges all around the country. And in every single case, the Trump supporters were unable to prove any election fraud. Now, the handful of individual cases, and they showed that the ineligible voter was oftentimes voted for Trump than Biden. It wasn't any kind of systematic effort to favor one party over another. So the reason why this is important is because this idea that without all of these enhanced measures, we've been overridden by massive electoral fraud is simply an optical illusion. And I say this, Jeffrey, because even such Trump stalwarts of William Barr, the former attorney general, who was appointed because he was a Trump loyalist, said, it's garbage out there. There isn't any evidence. We've looked at it. And this is somebody that didn't have a high threshold for investigating. He's the one that had John Durham appointed to see whether the investigation into the Trump campaign for taking aid from Russia was concocted. And that's his testimony under oath. So that's convincing evidence. Now, we also have to think about our federalist system when we think about voting fraud. And that is because the federal government has the right to set the standards for voting in federal elections. The state authorities have the right to set standards for voting in state elections. In federal elections, the Congress of the United States has enacted a law that says you need to be a citizen to vote, and you are avowing you need to check a box when you vote in a federal election that says you are under oath saying that you are a U.S. citizen, and that's good enough. You don't have to bring in your birth certificate or a visa or something like that. Now, most states follow that because it's less expensive to administer one standard for vetting for eligibility than two, but it's not required by the Constitution. Some other states, and I believe it's for the ulterior motive that you suggested, Jeffrey, to suppress votes, have tried to say, no, in a state election, you have to come up and provide some ID, personal ID proof that you are a citizen. Just your oath isn't good enough. And many voters are not well schooled in the laws, and they show up and they don't know why they can't vote in the state election. Because one of the things that's common amongst all these statutes, if you will, and efforts at voter suppression, you don't have previous findings of fact showing that the need for this enhanced vetting is because we've had this epidemic of fraud in the past, because there hasn't been any epidemic. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why are you doing this? There isn't even in the cases, and they're relatively few, of fraud. They've been much in favor of Trump as they were for Biden in 2020. So I think that in a country that celebrates government by the consent of the governed, there ought to be one standard for counting a vote. Can you identify the voter and the intent of the voter? that was the so-called the butterfly ballots, and how do you count ballots and determine, whether they were cast for one candidate or another if they didn't have a clear chad that was clipped out on for one candidate or another. And I think it's most regrettable that instead of encouraging civic responsibility and activism and engagement by voting, and I say this to Trump voters, the Biden voters, Harris voters, Trump voters, get out and vote. That's how we do things, by peaceful means. We don't do them by violence. And we're going to have a greater, I think, buy-in to the outcome of the election if we have it's transparent and we optimize, the pool of eligible voters rather than try to diminish it. It makes the outcome of the election more legitimate, not less.
I agree with that observation, and I think which gets to Florida has passed a law that these groups that go out and register voters, that if they make a mistake and falsely register of someone who's not a legal voter, the fines now are very high, and so they've basically been priced out of the business. They basically determined the business, because these are not necessarily very well-funded organizations, and especially less funded now that these supposedly Zuckerbergs, that basically was Zuckerberg, and I'm not an apologist for Zuckerberg, but Zuckerberg was basically giving local governments funding to help register voters. So, and he was registering voters in districts that had historically low voter turnout. So we would think it would be a good thing to register more people who have historically not voted to vote. But apparently that's a bad thing, to register voters to actually vote. And apparently by registering voters who have never voted, many people think we're disenfranchising people who have voted. Even if the new voters are legal voters, the fact is, if they haven't voted in the past, it seems like many people believe they've waived their right to ever vote again in the future. So even if they're a citizen. So in contract law, in almost all contract law, when there are breaches that are minor breaches, there's always an ability to cure breaches. I mean, so that's broadly prevalent under any circumstances. And also, I think one of the things that when I've said that has made, the things that make me proud of being an American is that we have a presumption of innocence, not a presumption of guilt. And not only do we have a presumption of innocence, I think about when I've thought about American society and the type 1, type 2 errors, which mistake, mistakes will always be made. The question is, what's your bias and which mistake you prefer making? And one of the things I've always said about our legal system, which might not be true anymore, is that we'd rather see a guilty person go free, than an innocent person be imprisoned. So I think in an empathetic society where we want to be decent, we know we're not always going to get it right. So which error do we want to make more often? And I think I think historically Americans have preferred to see guilty people go free than an innocent person imprisoned. I see now in the voting system, we'd rather see disenfranchised legal voters than see an illegal voter have the possibility of voting. So I think that flies in the face of what I believe has been something that has been a gold standard for justice around a philosophical approach to deciding that we're here to protect the innocent, and if a few guilty get to benefit because we protect the innocent, we feel it's worth it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's certainly true, Jeffrey. And to show how we've turned that presumption on its head in the privacy arena, we now target the not yet guilty for surveillance without warrants. Think of that concept, the not yet guilty. How's that for a presumption of innocence? Okay.
Well, now we're all the potential guilty.
Yeah, yeah, okay, the potential. But I think it's important also to underscore for the audience, when you're doing voter registration drives, you're not permitted, you don't ask the person you're registering who you're going to vote for. It's nonpartisan. You register and that's it. You don't ask them, it's like screening for justices to appoint to the Supreme Court. You can't tell them, well, how are you going to vote on these cases? So it's not intended to favor one party over another. And that's why this argument, you can make calculations looking on what you think that more unregistered voters are likely to vote for Harris as opposed to Trump. But those are just statistical calculations, and there's these people who project in the polls, they forget 1948. Dewey wins election, right? Headline. As Harry Truman entered the White House a second time. But I think we agree that the voter registration encouragement should be even-handed. It shouldn't be partisan in favor of any particular affiliation.
Yes, and it makes sense to put specific effort to register voters in areas where a large percentage of the voters, more than the average in the country, have historically not voted, to get them to participate in the political process.
Yeah.
So for those that want to be part of the political process, I personally have no interest in being part of the political process. I don't vote. I don't see any utility in voting, and I don't ever plan on voting. But I vote with my Bitcoin. So that's my advocacy is Bitcoin. And I feel as long as I keep accumulating Bitcoin, I don't have to worry about politics. Yeah. So, but for those who find utility in voting and participating in the political process, the objective should bring as many people feel and have as many Americans feel enfranchised than have many Americans feel disenfranchised. So like their voice doesn't count, like their vote doesn't count, like too many feel that their voice and vote, doesn't count. For me, it's irrelevant. I don't care whether my vote counts or don't count. So even if it did count, I wouldn't give a shit. I still wouldn't vote. But not many people agree with me, and I don't give a shit that people don't agree with me. So
Jeffrey, I take a little different slant. I haven't voted for either major party or any party for probably 30 years. I write in a vote, and it's either George Washington or James Madison. I want them to know that I'm trying, and the purpose is to send a signal to anybody out there who's running that I'm available. If you campaign on the right pitch, I'm going to go to the polls, but I'm going to write it in until you have somebody who's not dreadful.
Well, if George Washington was on the ballot again, I might reconsider. Thomas Jefferson, I might reconsider whether I would vote again or not. But nobody closely resembling either Washington or Jefferson or Madison is on the ballot, nor has been on the ballot for well over 100 years. So I guess you and I at least agree that there's nobody running for office that resembles what we think as what the founders intended America to look like.
Yes, correct.
So, because I guess that's your vote. Your vote is in voting those names in. Yeah. You don't see a candidate who comes close to resembling those people whose names you write in.
Correct. Jeff.
Okay, so let's get to the issue of nullification. Like I think as a principle, what many people might not remember or know is that maybe in my opinion, the greatest mind of the revolutionary period, Thomas Jefferson, while he wrote he's the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He actually was not at the Constitutional Convention and had no direct role in the construction of the Constitution. He was in France at the time, representing the country as the ambassador to France. So to the extent that he had any influence at all on the drafting of the Constitution, that it was through mostly his correspondence with people like James Madison. But ultimately his voice and his writing was not in the room when the Constitution got drafted, and I think there's a shame in that. Some of the fatal flaws that Jefferson had identified at the time and then somewhat later was, two fatal flaws, I would say, amongst other flaws. One was that the ability to win, that the generation that incurred debt should have an obligation to pay it off. And I think he had proposed, I can't recall, it was a 16 or 19 years. under which that all debt incurred needed to be paid off, so that there would be no intergenerational transfer of debt. And he thought that that was a fatal flaw in the drafting of the Constitution. While there's a lot of warnings about not issuing debt and using it rarely and paying it off, there was not a constitutional requirement that if there was a voting to issue debt, that it not be paid off, that it had to be paid off. So maybe the expectation was, given the fact that at that point in time, that money that the government really was not, there was no fiat money. I think many people might not even know that one of the main issues that caused Madison to call for a constitutional convention was the proliferation of states issuing fiat paper money. And it was one of the key issues that Madison wanted to prevent when he called the Constitution, was the printing of fiat money, and the aversion to fiat paper money was something that almost all the founding generation felt needed to be controlled, and that's why the Constitution ended up defining money as a fixed exchange into gold or silver. And at that point in time, what people called a dollar was actually a Spanish milled dollar. It was either a gold or silver coin that was divided into pieces of eights. So initially it was actually called a peso before we called it Spanish milled dollar, but it was the peso that was the Spanish coins, and they were the most credible forms of money during the Revolutionary period and immediately post-Revolutionary period until Jefferson established the mint. And the mint was not to print money. The mint was just to validate the authenticity of the content of gold, so to help prevent counterfeiting, which was pretty prevalent at the time. And the other fatal flaw that Jefferson talked about is he thought it was illegitimate for any generation to bind future generations. So he thought the Constitution should have a finite life to it. And somebody a number of years later, Lysander Spooner, also wrote some books, Vices Are Not Crimes, and the Constitution of No Authority. And Lysander Spooner argued that the Constitution had no authority because really no contract could bind anyone who was not a signatory to that contract. So going to all this, the concerns at this point in time was a system was designed with multiple checks and balances. And then the concern was, what if those checks and balances prove inadequate? What happens then? And the argument that Jefferson made, that Madison had fluctuated how committed he was to it or not, but nowhere near as Jefferson, was that basically there should be almost immediate recourse, that that ultimately the people who arbitrate the Constitution is not the Supreme Court, is not the federal government, but it's ultimately the state government and even the people. And the people had to be the right to be the ultimate arbiters of the of interpreters of the Constitution, because there was a concept that many people believed was a legitimate concept called jury nullification. That ultimately, if the government charged you with a crime, if a panel of your peers thought maybe what you did was illegal but not unjust, they had the right to not condemn you, not convict you for what they thought was an unjust law, and that they could basically nullify the law by the jury finding you guilty. So ultimately, the power ended up being preserved by the people, and that's basically what was the intention, was an exercise in self-government. So I think you have a little bit of a different take on that. But the question is, today, when we have a Leviathan state, and the checks and balances that the courts have interpreted, the people have obviously have proven insufficient to protect our inalienable rights and to limit government. So, looking at things from today, not only what you thought the intent was there, I would argue that what Jefferson talked about was necessary in order to prevent government tyranny has proven to be quite prescient. And basically, ultimately, the remedy relies in us, because the power is supposed to be reserved for the people. So Ninth and 10th Amendment. So what's your observations on this point?
Well, I certainly agree that ultimately the remedy relies in us. A culture that's so decayed and decrepit that won't defend liberty anymore and is just docile is not going to have any liberty. It goes back to Aristotle and courage. Courage is the first among virtues because without it, no other virtues are possible, including liberty. But I think that what you're touching on, Jeffrey, shows the importance of experience. You remember that initially in the Articles of Confederation, which were basically revamped and superseded by the Constitution, it was quite clear in the language of the Articles that every state had a right to disobey anything that was done by the Continental Congress operating under the Articles. They all signed, all the signatories, and the words were the sovereign states are getting together and having a pact. One of the deficiencies, and by the way, James Madison authored a very large tome to Jefferson explaining all what he saw were the deficiencies in the Articles. And remember, James Madison served in the Continental Congress under the Articles, so he wasn't an ivory tower scholar. He could see it up front, was that it had no ability to raise any money. You had to go beg to the states, and some of the states would give money, some would not give money. There was no national judiciary, so you couldn't have, no national or single spokesman, so you couldn't have international discourse with nations. Other nations were picking us apart. Didn't have any authority to regulate interstate commerce, so there was gross favoritism that the various states were giving to their own commerce. And so when the Constitution was created, although it didn't expressly say we renounce nullification, meaning that a state can go its own way, the dramatic difference in the opening of our Constitution as opposed to the Articles, which says we the sovereign states of America, our Constitution says we the people, not of the states, we the people of the United States. And the idea was, at least within its sphere of influence, the sphere of constitutional authority, the federal government was supreme. The states simply couldn't walk away from that idea. That was, and it wasn't that you can't amend the Constitution. That George Washington, who, by the way, in his farewell address said, hey, do not saddle future generations with taxes. If you have any decency, you should pay them off yourself because you're the one who enjoyed the benefits of the borrowing. But he said, we need to stick by the Constitution. If it's flawed, we need to amend it. But we just can't act extra constitutionally by decree and decide we don't like certain parts of it. It's true that Thomas Jefferson did communicate to James Madison while he was in France during the drafting of the Constitution. And Madison responded. He didn't agree with everything with regard to the idea that the Constitution should expire after 20 years, 19 years each generation. Theoretically, it sounds very good. Why should one generation bind a future generation? You and I, Jeffrey, we didn't have any role in drafting the Constitution, right? We weren't even alive.
We never consented to it.
Yeah, so that the argument that Madison made is pragmatic. He said that the convention in 1787 was a miracle just to get everybody to agree. And there would be such turbulence created if you had a new convention every 20 years that the cure is going to be worse than the disease. It's not that there isn't the disease that you've identified. It's still there. But Madison said, if the cure is worse, you got to live with the disease. This is what we have today. There's kind of a tacit, I think, if you don't decide to emigrate, we all have the right to leave the United States. If you stay and pledge loyalty, well, then you've at least tacitly said you're agreeing to abide by the Constitution. With regard to the worry about excessive spending, it was surely there. I mean, Jefferson wanted to prevent the government from borrowing money by amending the Constitution. Then you can't have any debt, because if you can't borrow, you can't go into debt. It didn't succeed. And even under Jefferson, there was borrowing done to execute the Louisiana Purchase, which was done in 1803 by treaty. I think we paid Napoleon $20 million for it, but it was paid back. We didn't have, and in fact, for a long time, the issues in campaigns were, what do we do with the surplus funds? It wasn't, how are we going to find money to fund the debt? Now,
even with the purchase, during the Jefferson administration, there was a reduction in spending. So
Oh, yes.
as expensive as the Louisiana's purchase was, he was able to cut in real terms and nominal terms, because we had no inflation then. He was able to reduce the scope of government, which was very limited in scope to begin with.
Yes, and he refused to have any kind of standing army either. We had, our international relations was the force of example, which triggered the French Revolution probably without firing a single bullet, or may have any single military force projected outside the Atlantic seaboard. Now, with regard to nullification, we understand that at least the checks that we initially envisioned that served us well for a long time have vanished today. For example, I think, Jeffrey, you mentioned the worry about inflated paper currency. Rhode Island was an especially egregious example. Well, the Supreme Court, the prohibition against laws that violated the obligation of contract were invoked to prevent paper money from being readily substituted for payment in gold and silver, if that was what negotiated. But unfortunately, we're kind of using a long time span. These kinds of checks today, have been eliminated. And they've been eliminated by both parties. It's not a partisan issue. And my judgment has been eliminated largely because, at least by the time of the Spanish-American War, when our economy was sufficiently robust, we had the ability, which we didn't have in 1787, to project the military abroad. We cut a Faustian bargain. We said, hey, let's succeed Britain as the empire of the world. We'll turn the Filipinos, we'll conquer them, we'll bring all the angelic Christian DNA to all the world by bayonets, and the heck with liberty. And that's where we began the waterboarding in the Philippines and all the other horrors that we see. We intervene in Panama and Mexico, Nicaragua, Haiti, Dominican Republic, all these other places. And unfortunately, that if you're going to have an empire, and Britain shows that, you can't have a rule of law. You got to have a Caesar. You got to have a Napoleon, decides everything. So this is basically what happened. World War I with Woodrow Wilson. I mean, Eugene Debs goes to prison because he thought the war was stupid and said, we shouldn't be fighting the Bolsheviks. Why are we involved in that? The worst violations of free speech, perhaps, in the history of the United States. And also talk about the debt, Jeffrey. During the war, our debt went from 1 to 30 billion national debt in a few years. Can you imagine that percentage increase, 1 to 30? I don't even have a number to describe what it is, but surely in the logarithmic area. And so the issue we're confronting today is what you pose is, okay, the expectations that the framers had, that even the unwritten norms of politics would be obeyed simply because of citizenry that was honorable and stricken by conscience, no longer obtained. You may recall, Jeffrey, that simply because George Washington said, I'm not going to serve at more than 2 terms, he didn't actually want to serve more than 1. That became an unwritten rule for 150 years till 1940.
Till Roosevelt.
It wasn't in the Constitution, because the respect given to the principles and standard was so great, it was like an unwritten part of the Constitution. That doesn't even exist anymore. We have politicians today, they don't hardly even know what happened. Not only yesterday, they don't certainly know what happened hundreds of years ago and have no philosophical foundation whatsoever. So, what do we do today in our system? We do have in our Declaration of Independence saying, listen, when a government becomes sufficiently oppressive, where it's systematically reducing you to serfdom, you have a right to dispose of it and start anew. It's not something that should be done hastily. I don't know whether we've quite gotten there.
No,
but
I would argue that we are serfs.
Yeah.
When you have, I guess how you divide society. Washington has been pretty clever in the fact is they've exempted about 50% of people from paying an income tax. And then you have a small percentage of the population that pays, that works 6 months a year for the government and then the rest of the year for themselves. But the reality is they're working longer for the government because we have about $200 trillion of unfunded liabilities that somebody's going to have to pay off, and we have a fiscal deficit of $35 trillion and growing. So that's basically taxation without representation, because the generation that didn't benefit from it, that's odious debt, that will have to end up paying for the unfunded liabilities, and eventually will have to pay for the fiscal deficit. So ultimately, that generation will be paying over 50% of their income in taxes. And so I don't know what one's definition of an indentured servant is. I know when people have asked, when people have been asking what percentage of the of income should be taxed, not knowing what tax rates are, most people don't come up with answers. 50% of income should be taxed, so it's significantly less. So I think in the Bible, the tax rate for people was 10%. So basically, God was sufficient with you taking 10%, and sharing it for the benefit of other people. But apparently, the United States government knows better than God and decides that they're going to tax a certain element of people at 50%, and a certain element of people will have a negative. Will basically have a negative income tax, because they will not only not pay taxes, they will receive money without paying tax. And I think Madison said that the role of government is not to transfer income from one group of people to another, and a number of people said that the fiscal discipline would end the day people realized they could spend other people's money. So if we took a look at the writing of the Federalist Papers, the correspondence that founders all had amongst themselves, what they had observed after they left office, continued to have correspondence, in 1810, 1815, between Jefferson and Adams and Jefferson and Madison, that now they are observers. They're all out of office, observing what has happened to the country relative to what they had hoped would happen at that point in time. Most of them were pretty disappointed then about the loss of freedom. So if then, when the federal government had, there was no administrative state, when federal government was spending, 2% of GDP, then they were concerned about the deprivations of people's liberties. Imagine what they would feel like today did they think that the checks and balances put in place were sufficient? Would Madison still say, no, I'm against nullification, given what I'm seeing today? I never would have expected that we'd have a government, that's spending where cumulative deficit is over 100% of GDP, where the government is making promises and not funding those promises, where we have military bases in over 100 countries, and all of this is funded with fiat paper money. What do you think they would be saying today? Would Jefferson be writing another Declaration of Independence from this government?
Well, I think it's a very challenging question, Jeffrey. And by the way, no, we have more than 800. It's not 100 military bases, but we got 800. We're squandering, $1.5 trillion.
I said in over 100 countries. I don't know how many
Oh,
bases.
well, yeah, for sure.
Over 100 countries.
Bases in yet, but 800 total. But anyway, putting that aside, I think that the challenge, Jeffrey, is not identifying the flaw, the disease, right? It's that you look around at our political culture and you say, okay, we get rid of that. What are we going to have to replace it that's superior? I gave a speech last week as introducing Mike Ledick. He was on the Fourth Circuit, both very critical of Trump versus United States. And I began saying, they signed their own death warrants, the 56 signatories to the Declaration of Independence, and they risked and gave that last full measure of devotion to secure life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, government by the consent of the governed. I said, how many in this room would have signed their own death warrants today? How many could we find would sign their own death warrants to take that risk? Because we know that the military industrial complex is not going to surrender easily. It's so huge, the trillions of dollars involved, the power. So the question is, given the corruption, the decay of the political culture, can we find anything superior? What's going to replace what we have? Because the building blocks is basically the same. It's society. It's like you were saying, Jeffrey, it's we the people. And where are we the people? There's no education system. People don't know anything anymore. They couldn't draft the Constitution. They would probably just create a formal rather than an informal king in the White House, just save us from this or that. And I think the reason why you can reasonably deduce, that kind of ignorance is just look at the low quality of the discourse in our politics. The presidential discourse, I mean, it's at a 6th grade level, promising, we're going to lower inflation by putting 100% tariffs on imports. We're going to solve the debt crisis by cutting taxes, but not increasing revenue. I mean, it's lunacy, economic lunacy out there on both sides. And notice, Jeffrey, neither Harris nor Trump has come within a light year of even mentioning the debt that you identify. No, they don't want to talk about it. It's like AIDS or the plague or something like that. So who are we going to get?
Well, Trump has said his tariffs will pay off the debt.
Yes, yeah, sure. Yeah, 1,000,000% tariffs. He doesn't understand.
How many people, given the fact that he said it, you think actually believe that that's true?
Unfortunately, I think a large
maybe 60 to 70% of Trump supporters might believe. I say the difference to me, and when some people ask me, what do I think is the difference between Trump supporters and Kamala supporters? I said, Kamala doesn't say very much of substance, and the reality is, people don't believe much of what she has to say. Yeah. So with Trump says incredibly insane stuff, and people believe it. That's the difference, is that many people are voting against Trump. So Kamala is if it's Trump or somebody else, she's an acceptable somebody else to many people. But it's not as if they're buying in to her; they're buying into her versus Trump. But with Trump, people are buying into when he says $85 billion was of the most recent to fancy, sophisticated equipment is in Afghanistan. 90% of his audience believes that, even though the audit came out at $7 billion and it's old stuff and no spare parts and things like that. So, and when he says he's going to, pay off the deficit with tariffs, people believe that. So that's the problem. Is the fact is, at least with the Kamala voters, the things that she says, they just say, okay, she's probably better than Trump, and maybe she is, and maybe she isn't, and I don't really care one way or another. What I do care is how as a society we can make informed decisions and reach a consensus. When we know so little. And believe so much that we shouldn't believe. So, and again, going back to what you said, is the question is what are the options? For me, I'm a big advocate of nullification. I'm a big advocate that since I'm a Jeffersonian, I think Jefferson was right. I think to the extent that, the concerns about have we built in a system of checks and balances sufficient to check government getting much power, which is what the Federalist Papers tried to convince us, right? The Articles of Confederation, when they met the Constitutional Convention, the intention was not to write a constitution, but to reform the Articles of Confederation. So when people went, they did not go under the guise of crafting a new constitution, but fixing the Articles of Confederation, and they ended up doing something completely different. They wrote a constitution, and they wrote a constitution trying to convince people, yes, the Articles of Confederation are bad. We'll make it better. But the question is if people see today the flaws of the Articles of Confederation and the flaws of the Constitution, what would you think that the people back then would have preferred as which mistake to be made? The states that were sort of like dysfunctional because they were a federation of states and a very loose federation of states, or how America began to be defined, I think mostly by Webster and Daniel Webster, and then Lincoln, where the greatest good was to preserve the Union, which was clearly not the greatest good at the time of the drafting of the Constitution. I think it was important to Washington, but I don't know if there was a consensus that amongst the people who voted to ratify the Constitution, were warned that a lot of the things that exist today would not exist if they approved the Constitution.
Well, let
So
me
if
just
they
interject,
had a
Jeffrey.
chance to vote again, the same people, if they had a chance to vote again, if they got to look at what was if they had a chance to peek at the future, and then they said, okay, here's the Articles of Confederation, here's the Constitution, we'll peek at the future of what we're going to be like. We're going to be an empire. We're going to have $35 trillion of debt. We're going to have 200 trillion of unfunded liabilities. We're going to have thousands of troops all over the world. We're going and we're going to be this empire and droning people and killing people everywhere, invading countries without a declaration of war. If people would have said, "Yeah, holy shit, maybe the Articles of Confederation are better than this." So, what do you think?
Well, Jeffrey, I think that the American people, voters, had full exposure to the critique, obviously not based upon what in the future happened because it didn't exist, but to the dangers that you've enumerated. The Anti-Federalist Papers at the Virginia Constitutional Convention to ratify, and you needed 9 states to ratify. The framers in Philadelphia didn't say, hey, our handiwork goes into effect without ratification. It didn't have any legitimacy unless there were at least 9 state legislatures who ratified. And there were 2 holdouts. North Carolina and Rhode Island didn't come in until 1791. But Patrick Henry, among others, voiced virtually everything you've said, warning Virginia, don't come in. You're going to create an empire. And Madison argued on the other side, and he prevailed. They had a vote. They didn't try to suppress free speech. It wasn't as though that there's Federalist Papers, there are Anti-Federalist Papers.
Right.
So, now, that doesn't mean that, even people who are well-informed can make miscalculations about the future, because that's why it's called the future. You don't know what it's going to be. And I think also
my question to you was this: if they saw what happened, because again, their argument is everything we see today would not happen. Okay. So if Madison if Madison and those who constructed, if Madison sat down with Patrick Henry today, if they could be resurrected and sit down in a room and have a conversation, and Patrick Henry said, look at today, I was right, you were wrong. What would you do now? Would James Madison say, well, okay, this is okay with me? So or would Madison recognize that the checks and balances did not adequately do their job and try and come up with another idea to provide, a greater check and balance? Maybe they would decide to those people, not the people today. The people today are kakistocrats. Okay, they're the worst element of society. But we, in the people who founded our country, were the best elements of society. Taking away, and I don't want to mitigate, the institution of slavery, but outside the issue of slavery, which was a horrible institution, and I don't want to have people think that I'm condoning the institution of slavery, because I certainly am not. No human being should ever be enslaved by another human being. But outside of that, when it came to considering the issues of governance, these were, we were very fortunate to have the group of people we had thinking through the issues of, now that we kicked out the British and we know we don't want a monarchy, what kind of government do we have that maximizes people's ability to express their own sense of liberty and freedom? Yeah. So as Louis Brandeis referred to, that the most valued right of every American, is the right to be left alone. So if they looked at it today, do you think they would, if Madison and Jefferson, Washington, Patrick Henry, George Mason, if they observed today, if they were resurrected for 1 year, and had a chance of, to saying we're okay with how this has evolved, or maybe, we should learn from what our flaws and rewrite another document. What do you think? What do you think we should have learned that we can improve, our system of governance, so we don't end up living off of debt and living off of other people? I'll give you an example of, I know we talk about, some people argue that the Bill of Rights were incomplete because they don't guarantee a minimum quality of life. A number of years ago, I was at this event a friend of mine hosted these Oxford-style debates in New York. So he had a sponsors dinner, and I was one of the sponsors. And so I'm sitting next to somebody and starts talking to me, and I ask, "What do you do?" And she says, "I'm in human rights." I said, "Okay, I like human rights. How could you be against human rights? So how do you what human right are you the one most interested in?" She said, "The human right to medical care." So I said, "Okay, well then, so I don't understand that as a human right. So one is a human right is us expressing our own liberty and freedom. But so what do you think? Do you think all doctors should be obligated to treat every patient, whether the patient has the capacity to pay or not?" She said, "No, I don't think that. Then I'm understanding if it's somebody's human right to medical care, then that should mean that every doctor should have the obligation to provide medical care." So she said, "No, everybody's got to fund medical care." I said, "So you have your human right is to take money away from me to pay for a benefit for somebody else. So, what about my human rights?" So I think I have a human right to keep the money I earned, and I don't understand why I have a responsibility to pay somebody else. That seems to me a deprivation of human rights. That's a transfer. And maybe if you read what the founding fathers, founding patriots of the country had to say about that is not a legitimate form of government, is to coerce one people to pay for the benefits of another group of people. Now, maybe I might voluntarily decide I will donate to hospitals, I will donate to philanthropic organizations, and Americans prior to the welfare warfare state were very generous in donations to many institutions, including building hospitals and helping to provide for people who were less fortunate in life. That we tended to do it pretty well by either people giving to philanthropic organizations or giving it through their religious institutions that would then help members of their congregation and communities. So that we did offer some sense of medical care treatment and some benefits for people, but it was all done on a voluntary basis because people felt that to be a good human being meant that you would do those type of things. Of course, when the government started doing it, people said, "What do I need to do it? Because the government's taking all my income. So what do I need to do this stuff for? Because the government has decided they're going to coerce themselves into being an agent on my behalf rather than me making those choices themselves." So again, the question is what would the founders be doing today if they got to sit back and say, if what we thought what the British government was imposing on the American people were tyrannical in nature and asserted their right, of independence? What do you think that they would do today if they sat back? I mean, I know this is pure speculation,
Yeah.
but you're a learned scholar, and you must have some opinion on what they would do if they had an opportunity of being able to do something about this.
Yeah. I don't know whether there is a solution here. They certainly, Jeffrey, I think where there's complete consensus between you and me that the framers would have been horrified by what they see today. Really a sacrilege of celebration of liberty as the nation's glory, not the armored knight, a Leviathan state. Agreed on how much we've degenerated. And that's why they warned at the outset. The very first State of the Union address of George Washington was, we will not preserve republic without education. You have to have a learned, engaged civic society. Otherwise, because that leaves its imprint on the laws. And that's why Jefferson's most cherished legacy was the University of Virginia. It wasn't Declaration of Independence. Creating a system of learning, recruiting scholars to teach. I think that, however, not squinting at reality, if they were alive today, they'd look and say, well, where's our successors? Who's going to draft this new document? We're in the grave. We don't do necromancy anymore. And remember, it was Madison in Federalist 55 said, even if every Athenian citizen were Socrates, a collection of them all would still be a mob. So they'd look around and say, my gosh, who's going to write this Constitution? It's not going to be the 55 who attended Philadelphia in 1787. So it goes back again to the issue of try to make sure the cure is not worse than the disease. They surely would recognize the disease. They surely would recognize this is not something that I believe would have been ratified in 1787. I think that's accurate. In fact, I've said, with regard to Trump versus the United States, if someone at the Constitutional Convention stood up and said, hey, let's have Article 2 changed to say the president is civilly and criminally immune from anything he does in the White House, he'd been run out, tarred and feathered, and evicted from the convention. It would be absurd to think that that proposal would garner a single vote. Yet it's now enshrined in constitutional law by gift of the U.S. Supreme Court in July 1, 2024, Trump versus U.S. But I go back again and say it's much easier to identify the flaw, the injustice, the outrage, than, given, I say, the decrepit nature of our political culture, who are we going to have? Tommy Tuberville, AOC, Kamala Harris, they're Donald Trump, they're going to be rewriting the Constitution. Now, Jeffrey, you would never want to entrust the future to them. Never. And I don't see who else. Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell. I mean, these people couldn't hold a candle to those who were in 1787. So it's a dilemma. It's a dilemma. We know we have something bad and we're suffering from it every day. And the challenge is, can we create something, given the degraded nature of our cultural DNA, that's less bad than what we have? I'd style it, it's a similar conundrum that confronted Arab Spring. Those who participated in the uprising, insurrection, they knew they had corrupt leaders, but they didn't have a plan to do something better. And they're all back to where they were before. This is over a decade later. The tyranny in Syria persists, in Yemen. I mean, I don't know, Yemen's not even a state, in Egypt and Tunisia. It's all back to square one. So it's just a very, very challenging issue as to the remedy. But certainly there's agreement on what the flaw is.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of observations and questions. I think one is directed at me and the other I'll direct at you. One person asked, what do I mean when I said that I vote with my Bitcoin? My answer is very simple. The fact is that Bitcoin is a financial asset and Bitcoin is a philosophical principle. That's how I vote. I vote with it as a financial asset because I put most of my net worth into Bitcoin. And for anyone who has started, especially early in the process of accumulating Bitcoin, if people from the very beginning, I publicly started advocating for Bitcoin. I started accumulating in 2009 and started publicly advocating for it in 2010. So anybody with even a small sum of money would now be a multimillionaire if they had listened to me when I began to publicly advocate for Bitcoin. So you have independence, and when you have financial independence, you don't have to worry so much about the stupid things that government does. And the reality is the price of Bitcoin is to some extent a reflection of the government debasing our money, debasing our freedoms. So given the fact that I think the government will continue to debase money, given the fact that I think governments will continue to debase freedoms, and given the fact that I think human beings will continue to debase themselves, as people debase themselves, as government debases money, as government debases everything it touches, one thing that cannot be subject to debasement is Bitcoin. So I put my money into Bitcoin because it's the only thing out there that cannot be debased. So, and then from a respect of what Bitcoin represents, I think Bitcoin would be the currency of choice of Thomas Jefferson, because what does Bitcoin represent? It's censorship resistant, that Thomas Jefferson was certainly like. It cannot be counterfeit. Jefferson would like that too. It's completely out of the control of government. Jefferson would like that as well. No matter how much Bitcoin you accumulate, you have no influence over Bitcoin itself. Jefferson would like that as well. So it's permissionless. Jefferson would like that as well. And it's got a well-defined, immutable monetary policy. So if you take a look at the attributes for somebody that loves liberty and freedom, if you had to look at something that has the attributes of liberty and freedom, there's no greater expression in any form of the attributes of liberty and freedom than the construct of the design of Bitcoin. So that's why I hold Bitcoin, because I think it's the greatest representation of my values. And I think it's the greatest representation of being able to accumulate wealth. And since Bitcoin, no asset has outperformed Bitcoin since the first Bitcoin was mined. So it's been the greatest representation, and maybe it's not a coincidence that the greatest expression of freedom and liberty and those values has also proven to be the greatest financial asset, it may be in the history of mankind so far. So that's what I mean. I vote with my Bitcoin. That's what I believe in. So I allocate. So how do I reflect what I believe in? That's where I put my money. I put my money where my mouth is. I believe in Bitcoin. Bitcoin's a reflection of my values, and that's what I vote with. I vote with my dollars in Bitcoin. So that's what I mean by that. Now there's an audience comment, Bruce, that I'll direct at you. The 800 military bases is the reason we don't need to pay. That's so probably this argument is the fact is that our dollar is backed by our military, essentially. Those bases secure our quality of life. This is what this person insists. Debt at a country level only matters to countries that don't have power. Our debt is other countries' problems. Well, I think that's what Connolly said when to the Europe, after we untethered the dollar from gold in 1971. He says it's our money, but your problem. Actually, it's proven to be our problem, because of the fact is that our money because of inflation has reduced the standard of living for most Americans, because it's a wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. It's a very perverse wealth transfer, because the very wealthiest get to create debt at very low rates, and everyone else gets to create debt at very high rates. So it's and the inflation has eroded people's standard of living, and the negative return from savings has eroded people's standard of living, except for the top 1/10 of 1%. So I disagree that that's preserved our quality of life. I think it's preserved the quality of life for a small percentage of the people by adversely impacting other people. But what do you think about the comment that the military is the reason why we don't have to preserve our quality of life?
Well, the military degrades the quality of life. Before we had standing armies, the United States' greatest growth trajectories was 100 years before we even had a standing army. We had ingenuity, had invention. We didn't have a Leviathan state. You're telling me military bases that we have in places like Chad, Burkina Faso, Vanuatu, Thailand, whatever, are important, to prevent someone from attacking us, I think is preposterous. It's a buy-in to the military doctrine of inflate a flea into an elephant so people will spend money on you. That we are the safest nation from invasion than any other nation in the history of the world. So we do not need these military bases abroad. They're there because of our vested, and this is not something that I invented. It was President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1960, and he was the leader of D-Day, right? He was not Code Pink, saying we need to be careful about the insidious influence of the military-industrial complex, having excessive influence in the corridors of power. The greatest military asset we have is not military bases. It's not even nuclear weapons. It's the willingness of its people to fight and die for their country because they love it, because it preserves their liberty. It cherishes the rule of law. That's the greatest asset any country has in defending itself. If you don't have a people who are going to fight and die for your country, you're going to be rolled over no matter what kind of weapons you have. I think in part, I just bring this out, that's why Israel showed that in 1948, 100 million Arabs and maybe 600,000 Jews. We know the result and we're living with it today. I'm not defending what Israel's doing today, but it shows you the importance of the loyalty of a citizenry to its country as the greatest military weapon we have. with regard to being the military kind of promoting commerce, I think that's ridiculous. Commerce persists because people like to make money. The trade is going to occur unless the government interferes. You're going to have willing buyers and willing sellers engage in commerce, because the wisdom of Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand is both sides win. Both sides think they're getting a good deal because they're not being coerced into being a buyer or a seller. We would, in my judgment, be richer by getting rid of the military bases. Taking all that expense, and it's huge. We now run a national security budget of about $1.5 trillion a year. And that could go into tax cuts. Hey, people can spend the money as they want. Buy schools, engage in the kind of charity that you suggested earlier, Jeffrey. I mean, that was Andrew Carnegie was hugely wealthy. Most of the libraries you see, public libraries around the country, they're Andrew Carnegie libraries. They were not the government libraries. He funded them because he was from Scotland and he understood the importance of education. So I think that there really is no experiential, factual, logical justification to believing our 800 military bases abroad are what enable the country to survive and to prosper. I think they're a dead weight on the United States, not a benefit.
I agree with you. The person who made that comment has added that they think you missed the point, that the military bases are not there to protect us from invasion. They're there to protect the U.S. dollar and its status as a petrodollar and the global reserve currency. I would like to take a shot at that. One is I think the value of the dollar as a global reserve currency is beginning to shrink. I want to make the point that at one point in time, the UK used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire, and the British Empire began to collapse as an empire after World War One. The collapse was complete by the end of World War II, where we moved from a pound sterling based monetary as the global reserve currency to the dollar as a reserve currency. So the British pretty much lost their influence for 30 years prior to the pound sterling no longer being the reserve currency of the world. So it's not as if that you begin to lose your influence, that it's overnight that you begin to lose your status as a global reserve currency. The fact is that the question is how sustainable is it that we can preserve ourselves as the global reserve currency of the world? And will our military and the petrodollar continue to be able to support that status? Yes, the petrodollar is what preserved the dollar as a global reserve currency. After it was untethered from gold, it became tethered to petroleum by requiring all the oil-producing states to invoice in dollars, which they didn't do prior to that. But the question is how long can we sustain that? And to the extent that if we continue to embrace irresponsible policies and other countries become an alternative to being the hard money, you see China trying to increase Russia and China are trying to increase how much gold reserves they have. Many countries are trying to increase how much gold reserves they have, and more countries are trying to collateralize their monetary base with reserves because they're trying to now compete with the dollar as a reserve currency of the world. It's not going to happen overnight, but ultimately our financial bankruptcy, will be reflected in a loss of our status as an empire and the loss of our status as a reserve currency, because this level of debt is just unsustainable. And the military can give it a longer life, but the military, I don't think, can give it a permanent life. Because there'll be more choices out there, and there'll be more choices out there, and the desire to have more choices keeps growing. This is what happens. The U.S. used to lead by example. Now the U.S. mostly leads by force. So when you lead by example, people are willing to take a global reserve currency when you're reasonably fiscally responsible, and you're not abusing your power as a hegemon. But as we become abusive in our power as a hegemon, and while we punish people who are stupid enough to hold our dollars because they keep on getting worth less and less and so people get poorer by holding our dollars. The question is at what point in time is there enough motivation to substitute away from dollars? Right now, there's not enough liquidity in alternative asset classes for that to happen overnight, but it's a slow erosion. And what we're going through is a slow erosion, where maybe each year it looks incremental, but somebody might look 30 years from now and might wake up and say, gee, I remember when the dollar used to be what everybody held, and now it's 30% of global reserve holdings, and it no longer has, and we can no longer force people to buy our debt at the type of subsidized interest rates we can do that right now. And we can't afford to have the basis in these countries, because now we're forced to have greater fiscal discipline, because we can't keep increasing the debt and thinking that the global capital markets will bail us out because people will have to buy our bonds. If you think this game is an infinite game, and we can play it out as long as we can, and that we can take advantage of this free lunch forever, maybe some people will make that bet. But I think the fact that Bitcoin's now at 63,000 indicates that a lot of people think, that's a bad bet, and most of the people who hold Bitcoin have not sold it in years, and people like myself think Bitcoin will be, worth 500,000 to $1 million a Bitcoin, and I think that's the case because the dollar will continue to erode in value. And I think the fact that how little confidence people have in the dollar, it's not like when you take a look at buying a house, that it's like everybody thinks the house is worth a lot more money. It's that people would rather hold wealth in a house than wealth in dollars, because they think they'll preserve their value and wealth in a house better than they will preserving their value, in a dollar. I saw an illustration of like a McDonald's hamburger that it's like gone up in the last since 1980. I think it's gone up like from 80 cents to like $6 or something. But not only has it gone up that much, it shrunk 40% in size. So the question is the McDonald's hamburger worth that because it's so much better than it was in 1980? Or is it or is it that the dollar sucks so badly that we have to spend so many more dollars to buy this hamburger, and now we have to spend a lot more money to buy a much smaller version of the hamburger because people think the dollar's worth is worthing less and less. So I think, when we take a look at inflation, inflation's a measure, and we have a very imperfect measure of inflation. There's a site called Shadow Stats, and Shadow Stats shows in the year 2000, the U.S. embraced this concept of hedonics for measuring inflation. Previously, it was like constructing a basket and pricing that basket over a period of time, and that was our calculation of inflation. Now it's like a little gamesmanship with the hedonics. So if we had calculated inflation the way we did in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was president, inflation would be about 5 points higher right now, and we would have never have recovered from the recession, of 2000, of the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. And I think if we calculate inflation the way we did in 1990, we'd still have the same circumstances as inflation being marginally higher. And maybe, I don't remember the exact numbers, but maybe also we have never really recovered from the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. So the question is part of the reason why there's so much angst in society, so much anger, so much frustration, is the reality people are not better off and haven't been better off for a long period of time. And they just have been able to borrow money not to improve their standard of living, but to sustain their standard of living, or not have it, debased so significantly. But the cost has been to accumulate a lot more debt in the process, making subsequent generations poorer in order so that we can continue to buy the stuff that we still want to buy. So, I'm not convinced that it's sustainable that our military will continue through the use of force, through the use of intimidation, through scaring nations that, you better continue to hold dollars or else. I think this will work for some period of time, and it has worked for some period of time. The question is, will it continue to work for the foreseeable future? and I think likely not. And while it isn't working, Americans are becoming poorer and poorer and poorer.
Jeffrey, I think that the gentleman who raised the question got at least partial right. I do think, and I agree with you, that the military is posted abroad in part to get other nations to act as our poodle because we give them a free defense budget. We tell them, okay, you don't have to invest in any of your own defense. We'll provide it for you, but you need to tell us, you need to do what we tell you, including keeping the dollar. But I think that is less motivated by just financial concerns than this delusion that we are God's new chosen people and we have been anointed to rule the world. And it's an outrage that China should call the South China Sea a China Sea just because it's off its border, that we should decide who gets maritime commerce in the South China Sea. This is the projection of global military power. That is what we cut a Faustian bargain with over 100 years ago. And it's because we get this juvenile vicarious thrill of saying, see, we're number one. In the words of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, we are the indispensable nation. And then we have Hillary Clinton boasting like Julius Caesar after she orchestrated the overthrow and killing of Gaddafi. We came, we saw, he died. I mean, this is juvenile, childish celebration. And that's why we're projecting this military force. The same reason, stupidity, why Napoleon invaded Moscow in the winter. You know, it wasn't for money, because there's an intoxicating effect of this lust for power that dwarfs and will create the greatest financial lunacy. And the British, as you point out, bought right into it. Jeffrey, they knew they couldn't support this anymore. They kept spending, and they still go into the Falkland Islands even when they're bankrupt, you know. And that's that is, I find, the greatest pathology we have in our culture today, that we no longer have our glory as liberty. The glory is the march of the mind. Our glory is now as the armored knight, the foot soldier. Hey, we can go anywhere we want, tell anybody what we want to tell them, and force them and drop bombs and drones and coerce them. And that certainly is the opposite of the vision of the framers.
Yeah, going back to how do you think? Do you think if with George Washington, you know, John Adams, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, you know, John Hancock got together and said, how should we commemorate the 4th of July, the signing of this sacred document called the Declaration of Independence? Well, I think what we should do is have a great military display of power, of force, and that's what this Declaration of Independence represented. Do you think that would be the way that they would show was the purpose of the Declaration of Independence, to show massive military force was the greatest way of displaying what the Declaration of Independence was all about?
Yeah. Of course not. They would have been abhorred by even that concept. And they would celebrate, and as John Adams, they would celebrate books, learning. They would celebrate poetry, drama, Aeschylus, Sophocles, not military might. They would celebrate the thinker, not the armored knight. Unfortunately, we are so far away from that, Jeffrey. It's like living in a different Milky Way where we are today culturally from that time.
Well, Bruce, thank you very much for this conversation today. As always, it's very stimulating speaking with you. And I think we will be back if we'll have to see what happens this week. But I guess that in the advance of the Trump trial under the court of Tanya Chutkin, there are going to be a pretrial hearing scheduled for the Thursday. And I guess I read that Smith has the brief he's filed has gone from 45 pages to 180 pages. The intent is to show to the American people the evidence Smith has accumulated to date, or at least a good part of the evidence of basically presenting the case he would present at trial, and we'll find that if Chutkan is willing to make that case public, or will keep it under seal. What the efforts Trump will make this week to keep it under seal, and if the evidence is presented, so that while the American people might not be able to see a trial, they at least will be able to see a good portion of the evidence that would be presented at a trial, before judging their opinion about whether this is a witch hunt or has legitimacy. And if there is a revelation of evidence as a consequence of Chutkan's rulings that might have the Supreme Court also intercede or not. But if there's something to talk about, that you and I will have a conversation about whatever's released, what it says, and what it means. So I look forward to that if there's an opportunity to talk about that, because it's not under seal. So in principle, if it's not, you and I will be speaking, I guess maybe the 27th or something,
Sure.
to discuss what's been revealed, if anything of substance has been revealed.
Yeah,
so thank you very much again. Okay.
Yeah, we should just note, Jeffrey, the Trump lawyers are furiously filing motions to insist that all of this be sealed until after November. It's not just in the short run. They don't want a crumb of this evidence in the public domain. Of course, they have the right to file whatever exculpatory evidence they think is prevalent, right? It's not like only at this stage, only the prosecutor can present it. But they want clearly a blackout until after November. Now, whether the judge goes along is something we'll find out very soon.
And whether the Supreme Court will intercede if the judge doesn't rule the way Clarence Thomas wants them to rule. I guess somehow, if there's evidence a crime has been committed, that providing that evidence, a discovery and a disclosure of discovery, is election interference for people knowing what they probably should have the right to know, but are being deprived of the right to know. It's funny. They all argued that people should know what was in the Hunter Biden laptop, okay? But nobody should know the evidence that's been accumulated in any of these cases. Yeah. So I find an asymmetry between essentially what's the public's right to know and what's not the right to know. Trump invited, when they had the WikiLeaks revelation of Hillary Clinton's emails, Trump celebrated that. His son met to see whether there was more stuff they could get, and he made an invitation to further hack her servers to see what more they came out. I mean, later he claimed he was just kidding, but we know that's bullshit. And now that Iran has seemingly hacked his computers and his correspondence, I wonder what Trump would say if Kamala came out and said, "Hey, Iran, make everything public, and why don't you keep hacking and see what more you could find?" So notice the difference in how the Kamala campaign, which has made really no comment on this issue and doesn't seem to be facilitating the disclosure of whatever was hacked, while the Trump campaign not only facilitated disclosure, they were looking to find out what more they could get and encourage more disclosures. So I just think that comes with the the hypocrisy of the American people. And as I always think this reflects worse on us as a people than the candidates themselves. The candidates do this because we like it. So if we didn't like it, they'd behave differently. So it's such a shame. We should, anything that's relevant, we should be out there. And I think you just made a very important point that I forgot to mention, and it's great that you mentioned it. Is while Smith and their attorneys can provide whatever evidence they think has been accumulated to date, to proves Trump, to try and prove Trump's guilt. Trump's lawyers can also have the opportunity to present whatever exculpatory evidence that they have to counter whatever Smith has presented, so the American people can see the best arguments of both sides. And that's what I think we're entitled to see. We're entitled to see the best arguments of both sides, because we know what will happen if Trump wins. If Trump wins, Smith will get fired, and we'll never see the evidence.
Yeah.
So whatever evidence existed, the American people will never know that existed.
Yeah.
So because Smith will be fired, all the evidence will be shredded. Nobody will have any obligation to do it. And who knows if anybody else will be called in front of I guess the only way we might learn something is if the Democrats control one of the legislatures and they decide to subpoena Smith and ask for his testimony, and then maybe Trump will say, "I have immunity," and Clarence Thomas will say, "Smith, you can't talk, or you're a traitor if you talk," and then you could be put in jail. So I think this is how absurd all of this has become.
Yeah, agreed.
So, you have any last words, Bruce? I'll give you the last word. I don't want to take the last word myself.
No. Listen, I very much encourage the audience. I think we hope that Jeffrey and I are able to provide enlightenment. We're not here trying to speak the gospel. We're trying to speak, civilized discourse, get refinements on wisdom and understanding. And that's what we think is the ultimate salvation for the country.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.